My twos. Laura, where are they?
I sold them, Dad. It's not safe for you to be operating machinery anymore.
My life's work. What have you done?
The court declared Arthur incompetent on a Tuesday, on the word of the one person he trusted most in the world. How does a man, stripped of his own signature, his own voice, prove his mind is still his own? The gavel fell on the same afternoon he had finally glued the last tiny mast to the model schooner for his grandson, a project that had taken 500 hours of steady-handed precision. He'd crafted the kitchen cabinets from solid cherry, the wood glowing with a warm reddish light that seemed to hold the memory of every sunset it had ever witnessed. Each door closed with a satisfying, whisper-soft click that spoke of impeccable craftsmanship, a sound that had been the quiet percussion of his domestic life for decades. The story they uncovered was a sad, predictable tale of desperation. Laura and her husband Rick had bought a franchise for a trendy fitness studio 2 years prior, sinking all their savings into it. The business had failed spectacularly, leaving them with a mountain of debt. They had taken out high-interest loans to cover their losses, and the lenders were threatening to foreclose on their house. Arthur's carefully cultivated nest egg wasn't just a windfall for them, it was their only way out. They weren't just greedy, they were drowning, and they were pulling him under with them. The smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Arthur, trying to jog his memory for Ben's assignment, thought to reconnect with an old friend from his woodworking club, a retired accountant named George. It took a secret, hurried phone call from Sarah's phone during one of Laura's shopping trips, but George agreed to meet. At a park halfway between their houses, sitting on a cold bench under a large oak tree, Arthur told George everything. George was horrified, his face paling as Arthur spoke. But he also had a crucial piece of information. "I remember something about Rick, Laura's husband," he said, his brow furrowed in thought. "He was always talking about his big plans. About 1.5 years ago, he tried to get me to invest in some commercial real estate deal he was putting together. Said it was a sure thing, a strip mall development. I took one look at the prospectus and knew it was junk. Bad location, unrealistic projections. I told him to run away from it. Ben's follow-up investigation, guided by George's tip, revealed the final, devastating truth. Not only had the gym franchise failed, but Rick had also lost over $100,000 of their borrowed money in that speculative real estate scheme, a fact he had hidden from Laura. This wasn't just about paying off business loans. It was about covering up a catastrophic financial secret. Laura's conservatorship over her father was the final desperate act to patch a hole in a dam that had already burst. Ben also located the landscape painting. It hadn't been sold to Westgate appraisers. Laura had used them to get a formal appraisal, then used the painting as collateral for a short-term, high-interest personal loan from a shady lender. The payment Arthur had seen was merely for the appraisal service. The painting, his last physical link to Eleanor's family, was now sitting in a vault, held hostage by a loan shark. They had everything. The clear financial trail. The motive. The proof of lies. And they had Arthur's notebooks, a powerful testament to a mind that was sharp, detailed, and far from incompetent. As they prepared for the court date, Arthur felt a feeling he hadn't experienced in months, a sliver of righteous anger, hot and clean, burning away the cold fog of despair. He was no longer a victim. He was a man preparing for a fight. The courtroom was just as beige and impersonal as he remembered, but this time, Arthur did not feel like a ghost. He sat at the plaintiff's table with Ben Carter, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the stack of notebooks he had so painstakingly filled. Across the aisle sat Laura, her face a mask of worried piety. She shot him a look of wounded betrayal, as if he were the one who had done something wrong, a look that turned his stomach. The same judge presided, her expression weary as she looked over the case file, a flicker of recognition in her eyes as she looked at Arthur. His hands, though now wrinkled and spotted with the cartography of age, were still steady, still knew the language of wood better than any other. The calluses on his palms were old friends, records of a lifetime of labor and love. Retirement hadn't changed his nature. It had only given him more time to perfect his craft on a smaller scale. Laura's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a devoted daughter struggling to care for a declining father who is now being manipulated by a disgruntled home health aide with a personal vendetta. It was a compelling story, but it was a work of fiction. Then it was Ben's turn. He didn't begin with accusations. He began with Arthur. He called Arthur to the stand. Ben's questions were simple and open-ended. He asked Arthur about his career, his marriage, his hobbies. He asked him to explain the difference between a mortise and a tenon joint. He asked him to describe the financial strategy he and his wife had followed for 40 years. Arthur, clutching his notebooks not as a crutch but as a testament, spoke clearly and confidently. He told his story. He didn't sound confused or agitated. He sounded like what he was, a lucid, intelligent man who had been wronged. Then Ben turned to the events of the past year. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice ringing with clarity in the quiet room, "can you tell the court about your tools?" Arthur's voice cracked for the first time as he described the empty workshop, the loss of a lifetime's collection. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, my daughter said I was a danger to myself with those tools. A week before she took them, I finished a model ship that has over 2,000 individual pieces and requires hundreds of hours of focused concentration. That is not the work of a man with a failing mind. It is the work of a man whose hands are still steady." Next, Sarah took the stand. She was nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but she spoke with unshakable conviction. She detailed the isolation she had witnessed, the controlled communication, the way Laura spoke for her father, as if he weren't in the room. She presented the photographs of the financial statements she had taken, her testimony providing the context for the paper trail Ben was about to reveal. Finally, Ben presented the evidence he had uncovered: the failed gym franchise, the mountain of debt, Rick's disastrous real estate investment, and the pawn ticket for the collateralized painting. He laid out the timeline with a large chart, showing how Laura's petition for conservatorship coincided exactly with the moment her family's financial world was collapsing. The narrative was undeniable, a cold, hard story told in numbers and dates. This was not an act of protection. It was an act of plunder. When Laura was called to the stand for cross-examination, her composure finally shattered. Faced with the evidence of her husband's secret losses and her own calculated deception, she broke down, her curated performance dissolving into raw, ugly sobs. Ben was relentless, but not cruel, asking simple questions that backed her into a corner of her own lies. "Mrs. Miller, when you told this court your father was forgetting to pay his bills, was that before or after your husband lost $100,000 in the Edgewood property deal?" She couldn't answer. She just wept, admitting everything in a torrent of self-pity, framing it as a desperate attempt to save her family, to give her son Leo the life she felt he deserved. "I was going to pay it all back," she cried, looking at Arthur. "I just needed some time." The judge listened, her face grim and unreadable. At the end of the day, she cleared the courtroom of everyone but Arthur and Laura. She looked at Arthur with an expression of profound regret. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the court owes you an apology. Your rights were taken from you under false pretenses. The conservatorship is terminated, effective immediately." She then turned to Laura, her voice losing all its warmth, becoming as cold and hard as steel. The basement workshop was his sanctuary, smelling perpetually of sawdust, varnish, and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. This was where he built intricate model ships, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble as they tied miniature rigging and planked tiny decks. He was 72, a widower for 5 years since his beloved Eleanor had passed, but he was not idle or infirm. "What you have done to your father is not just immoral, it is criminal. I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation into charges of perjury and felony, elder fraud." The sound of the gavel falling this time was not a crack of doom, but a thunderclap of liberation. In the aftermath, there was no triumphant celebration. There was only a vast, quiet sadness. Arthur had a final, painful conversation with Laura before the criminal proceedings began. They sat in the living room, in the same chairs where they had shared Sunday dinners for years. the space between them now an unbridgeable chasm. There were tears and apologies from her, a desperate litany of excuses and regrets, but the words were meaningless now, like counterfeit money. The trust, the fundamental pillar of their relationship, had been pulverized into dust. "I loved you," Arthur said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate in his mouth. "I would have helped you. I would have given you anything. All you had to do was ask." That was the part he could never understand, the deepest cut of all. The betrayal wasn't just in the taking. It was in the not asking. He won his life back, but in that courtroom, he had lost his daughter forever. Arthur's journey to healing was slow and uneven. With the help of Ben and Sarah, he began the arduous process of untangling the financial mess Laura had created. He got the painting back from the lender, its familiar presence on the living room wall a small comfort. He bought new tools, shiny, unfamiliar, without the history of the old ones, and began slowly to fill his workshop again. The familiar scent of sawdust was a comforting balm to his wounded soul. Sarah became a fixture in his life, no longer a home health aide but a true friend, a surrogate daughter forged in a crisis. They would have dinner together, and she would bring her son Leo to visit his grandfather. Seeing his grandson, a bright, funny boy untainted by his parents' mistakes, gave Arthur a reason to look forward, a reason to build again. He found a new purpose, volunteering with the same legal aid society that had helped him, speaking to other seniors about the importance of protecting themselves. He shared his story, not for sympathy, but as a warning and a source of strength for others. His experience left him with hard-won wisdom, lessons etched into him like the grain on a piece of oak, which he felt compelled to share. First, he learned the critical importance of proactive legal planning. A will is not enough. He now understood that a well-drafted, durable power of attorney and a living trust, created with a trusted lawyer long before any crisis, are not luxuries, but necessities. He advised everyone to name not just a primary agent, but also a secondary, and to have frank, detailed conversations with them about their duties and your wishes. Hope for the best, he would tell them, but plan for the worst. Second, he saw that isolation is the predator's greatest ally. His daughter's first move had been to cut him off from his friends and his routines to make him an island. He learned that maintaining a vibrant social network, friends, neighbors, clubs, church groups, is a powerful form of security. A community is a web of eyes and ears, a defense against those who thrive in secrecy. A person alone is a target, he'd say. A person with friends is a fortress. Finally, he learned the painful lesson of trusting but verifying. Even with the people you love most, especially with the people you love most, financial transparency is not a sign of suspicion. It is a sign of a healthy relationship. He was a man of routine and quiet purpose, a man who believed in the solid, tangible world he could build with his own two hands. His financial life was built on the same principles as his woodworking: patience, prudence, and planning. He urged his peers to stay involved in their finances, to review their own statements, to ask questions, and to never cede complete control, no matter how convenient or loving the offer may seem. As he stood in his workshop one day, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window and illuminating the dancing dust motes, he picked up a fresh block of basswood. It was smooth and pale, a blank slate. He wasn't sure what he would carve yet, but his hands, though scarred, were steady. He had been through the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. He had faced the ghost his daughter had tried to make of him, and had proven to the world and to himself that he was still made of solid wood. He and Eleanor had been children of the Depression's long shadow, taught by their parents to save what they could, avoid debt like the plague, and trust in the slow, steady power of compound interest. Arthur had worked for the same reputable furniture company his entire career, starting in the sanding room and working his way up to master craftsman, contributing dutifully to his pension plan with every paycheck. He'd paid off their modest two-story home in 1998 and had celebrated by burning the mortgage papers in a coffee can in the backyard, a ritual of freedom he remembered with a smile that now felt like a relic from another man's life. Eleanor had danced with him on the grass, her laughter like wind chimes in the cool evening air, the smoke curling up into the twilight. His Social Security check arrived on the 3rd of every month, a dependable stream he added to the modest but solid portfolio of mutual funds a local financial advisor helped him manage. He wasn't rich, not by the standards of the television commercials that screamed about luxury cars and exotic vacations, but he was secure. He was comfortable. He had enough to live well, to spoil his grandson Leo with elaborate birthday gifts, and to know, with deep satisfaction, that he would never be a burden to his only child, his daughter, Laura. Laura was his pride, his connection to the future, the living embodiment of his and Eleanor's love. After Eleanor died from a sudden illness that had stolen her from him in the space of a single season, Laura had stepped into the role of caregiver with a gentle efficiency that had soothed the raw edges of Arthur's grief. She would call every day, her voice a bright counterpoint to the oppressive silence of the house. "Just checking in, Dad. Did you eat lunch? Don't tell me you just had coffee again." It was the ultimate fear realized, to be erased by your own family, to become a ghost in your own home, your life savings, nothing more than a ledger controlled by someone else. But the truth of his daughter's desperate act was far darker than a simple grab for money. It was a secret wrapped in years of resentment. She'd bring groceries on Wednesdays, her bags filled with healthy foods he wouldn't think to buy for himself, and stay for dinner on Sundays, filling the quiet house with chatter about her work as an office manager and Leo's latest triumphs in Little League. He would watch her move around the kitchen, her gestures so reminiscent of Eleanor's, and feel a pang of both sorrow and profound gratitude. Arthur trusted her completely, implicitly. When she mentioned about a year ago that it might be easier if she helped him with his online bill payments, he'd readily agreed. The digital world felt like a foreign country to him, a place of shifting passwords and two-factor authentications that seemed unnecessarily complex. "You've got enough to worry about, Dad," she'd said, her hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "Let me take this one little thing off your plate." He had given her his passwords, written them down on a slip of paper from the notepad by the phone, feeling not a loss of control, but a wave of gratitude for her thoughtful care. He saw in her the best parts of Eleanor, the same organizational skills, the same practical approach to life. He had made her his power of attorney years ago, a decision that felt as natural and right as naming her the sole beneficiary of his will. She was his daughter. Who else could he possibly trust? He missed the early signs, the subtle shifts in the current that warned of a coming storm. He was a man who looked for soundness in structure, not subtlety in behavior. He attributed her occasional shortness of temper to stress at work. "The quarterly reports are a nightmare, Dad," she'd say with a sigh, rubbing her temples. "Everyone wants everything yesterday." He'd nod sympathetically, remembering his own deadlines. When she suggested he sell his old pickup truck because the insurance and upkeep were just bleeding money, he'd resisted at first. He loved that truck. It held memories of fishing trips with Eleanor and hauling lumber for countless projects. He could still smell the faint aroma of bait and sawdust in the cab. But Laura was persistent, showing him spreadsheets she'd made on her laptop, outlining the costs in neat, unforgiving columns. "It's a money pit, Dad. It just makes sense. You could put that money into a better-yielding CD." He eventually relented, though it felt like giving up a piece of his past. She was probably right. He didn't drive it much anymore. When she started screening his calls, explaining that she was just blocking all those terrible telemarketers who prey on seniors, it felt like protection. "They're vultures, Dad. I won't let them get to you." Each suggestion was cloaked in the language of love and concern, a velvet glove hiding an iron hand. He was a man who believed in the structural integrity of things, and the foundation of his life was the belief that his daughter loved him. It was a joint he never thought to inspect for weakness, a cornerstone he assumed was solid granite. The idea that this foundation was riddled with dry rot, that it was about to collapse and bring his entire world down with it, was simply utterly unthinkable. It began with small, orchestrated moments of confusion, tiny cuts designed to make him bleed confidence. One morning, Laura called, her voice tight with panic. "Dad, you missed your cardiology appointment. They just called me. Are you feeling okay? Did you forget?" Arthur, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, the steam warming his face, frowned and walked to the calendar hanging by the phone. Who was the woman in the back of the courtroom with worried eyes, and what did she know that could give him his life back? The court declared Arthur Vance incompetent on a Tuesday, on the word of the one person he trusted most in the world. The pronouncement landed not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating finality of a coffin lid being closed. There was nothing on it for that day. He was meticulous about his appointments, writing them down the moment he made them in his neat block lettering. "There's nothing here, honey. Are you sure it was today?" Her voice on the other end was a symphony of worried affection. "Oh, Dad, yes, I'm sure. I wrote it down on my own calendar right after you told me about it. Don't worry, I'll reschedule it. But you gave me a scare. You really need to be more careful about these things." He felt a flicker of unease, a sense that a gear had slipped somewhere deep inside his own mind. He was so sure he hadn't made that appointment, but her absolute certainty was a powerful counterweight to his own. He let it go. Maybe he had forgotten to write it down. A week later, a bill for his property taxes was suddenly overdue. Laura found it on his desk, tucked under a woodworking magazine, waving the red-stamped envelope with a dramatic sigh. "We have to be more careful, Dad. These penalties are ridiculous." He knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he had paid it. He remembered writing the check, sealing the envelope, and putting it in the mailbox at the end of the driveway on a particularly windy Tuesday. He even remembered the number of the check, but there was the notice, undeniable and official. Doubt, like a damp chill, began to creep into the warm certainty of his well-ordered life. He started to second-guess himself. Maybe he had forgotten to put a stamp on it. Maybe his memory wasn't as sharp as he thought. These manufactured incidents became the drumbeat of a campaign he didn't know was being waged against him. Laura would ask him to recall a recent conversation, and when he stumbled on a minor detail, was it Tuesday or Wednesday they had talked about the leaky faucet, she would sigh and say, "See? That's what I'm worried about. You're getting things mixed up." She took him to a new doctor, a Dr. Evans she had found online, someone outside of the local network of physicians he had known for decades. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit examination room, which smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, Laura did all the talking. She sat on the stool beside him, holding his hand, her face a perfect mask of filial concern. She recounted the missed appointment, the unpaid bill, moments where Arthur had misplaced his keys or forgotten a name at a family gathering. She framed each normal lapse of a 72-year-old mind as a terrifying symptom of cognitive decline. "He gets agitated," she told the doctor, her voice trembling slightly, while Arthur sat there, mute and stunned on the crinkly paper of the exam table. "He's forgetting to eat. I'm just so worried he's going to hurt himself." Arthur tried to interject, to explain that he'd never missed a meal in his life, that the keys had been in his other jacket, but his protests sounded weak and defensive against his daughter's tearful, compelling performance. "Dad, don't get upset," she'd say, squeezing his hand. "We're just trying to help, Dad." Evans, a busy man with a crowded waiting room and a perpetually rushed air, scribbled notes on a pad. He asked Arthur to draw a clock and repeat a series of words. Arthur, flustered by the pressure and humiliated by the situation, fumbled the tasks. How does a man, stripped of his own signature, his own voice, prove his mind is still his own? The gavel fell with a dry, definitive crack on the same afternoon he had finally glued the last tiny mast to the model schooner for his grandson Leo, a project that had taken 500 hours of steady-handed precision. His hand shook as he drew the clock face, making the numbers uneven, and the words, apple, table, penny, seemed to evaporate from his mind the moment they were spoken. The doctor's resulting report was a clinical, devastating portrait of a man losing his grip on reality. Then came the legal papers. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, and Laura, as if by magic, was there to intercept it from the mail carrier. She opened it at the kitchen table, her expression one of sober responsibility. "It's just a formality, Dad," she said, her voice soft and low, the voice one uses in a hospital room. "It's called a conservatorship. It just means I can legally help you with your finances and medical decisions. With your memory getting a little Foggy. It's the responsible thing to do. It protects you. The word incompetent leaped out at him from the jargon-filled pages. It felt like a slap, a physical blow. Laura, I'm not incompetent. I just finished the rigging on the Charles W. Morgan. That takes focus, precision. He pointed toward the living room, where the magnificent model sat on the mantelpiece, a monument to his clarity of mind. She patted his hand, her touch now feeling less like comfort and more like a restraint. I know, Dad. I know you're brilliant with your hobbies. This isn't about that. This is about protecting your assets, protecting everything you and Mom worked so hard for, so no one can take advantage of you. She made it sound like an act of profound love, a shield she was raising to protect him from the world. In reality, she was the one from whom he needed protecting. The court hearing was a blur of beige walls, worn-out carpeting that smelled faintly of mildew, and the muffled coughing of strangers. Arthur sat beside Laura, who held his hand tightly in a grip that was supposed to be supportive, but felt like a manacle. He hadn't hired a lawyer. Laura had gently dissuaded him. It would be an unnecessary expense, Dad, and it sends the wrong message, a sign of combativeness that would only upset the judge. We're on the same side here. This is a team effort. Her own lawyer, a man with a slick smile and a cheap suit, presented their case with a practiced air of solemnity. He read from Dr. Evans's damning report. He submitted the overdue bill and a printed-out email about the missed appointment as evidence of mismanagement. Laura took the stand and wept, speaking of her deep love for her father and her terror that he would fall victim to a scam or neglect his own health. "I'm only doing this to keep him safe," she sobbed, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do." The judge, a tired woman in her late 50s with deep lines etched around her eyes, looked at Laura with undisguised sympathy. When the judge asked Arthur if he had anything to say, he stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his daughter, her face streaked with crocodile tears, at the slick lawyer, at the impassive face of the court. The words caught in his throat. What could he say? That his daughter, his beautiful, loving daughter, was lying through her teeth, that this was all a monstrous, intricate mistake? It sounded insane, paranoid, even to him. He stammered a few words about his workshop, about being fine on his own, but his voice lacked conviction, swallowed by the cavernous room and the weight of the moment. The delicate, nostalgic scent of wood glue and varnish still hung in the air of his basement workshop, a testament to a mind fully engaged, a life fully lived. But upstairs, in the world of legal documents and sober-faced judges, that life had just been signed away. He sat down, utterly defeated. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, a sound that severed his life into a before and an after. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer Arthur Vance, competent adult, master craftsman, husband, and father. He was a ward of the court, a legal child, and his daughter, his loving, concerned daughter, was his keeper. The silence that followed the judge's ruling was the most profound Arthur had ever known. It was the silence of a door being locked, the silence of a life being placed in a box too small to hold it. As he walked out of the courtroom, his daughter's arm linked through his in a gesture that now felt proprietary, the world seemed to have lost its color. The familiar oak trees outside the courthouse were just gray shapes. The sky was a flat, washed-out blue. Laura kept up a stream of soothing chatter on the drive home. "It's for the best, Dad. You'll see. Now you don't have to worry about a thing. Not a single bill, not a single phone call. I'll handle everything." But all Arthur could feel was a cold, creeping dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't being relieved of worry. He was being relieved of his own life. Back at home, the house he had built and maintained for 45 years no longer felt like his. It was a decorated cage. The first change was the mail. Laura installed a locking mailbox and kept the only key. "To prevent mail fraud," she explained brightly. Then came the phone. She changed his plan, blocking all outgoing calls except to her number and 911. "To stop the scammers," she said with a cheerful nod. His checkbook vanished from his desk drawer. His credit cards disappeared from his wallet. Laura gave him a prepaid debit card with $50 on it. "This is your allowance for the week, Dad. For coffee or a magazine. Just give me the receipt so I can keep track of it for the court records." The humiliation was a physical thing, a constant weight in his chest, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He was a man who had managed a household, raised a child, saved and invested for half a century. Now he had to ask for permission to buy a tube of toothpaste. One afternoon, he wanted to buy a specific brand of wood polish, the kind with beeswax and orange oil that he'd used for years. He saw it in the hardware store flyer. It cost $7. He called Laura. "I'm a little busy, Dad. What is it?" "I need some more money on my card," he said, his voice small. "I want to buy some furniture polish." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Dad, the polish you have is fine. We can't just be spending money frivolously. I'll pick some up for you next time I'm at the store." The line went dead. He sat there, phone in hand, staring at the wall. It wasn't about the polish. It was about the $7 of his own money he wasn't allowed to spend. Friends from his old woodworking club would call, and Laura would answer, her voice full of saccharine concern. "Dad's not really up for calls right now. He gets so confused and it just tires him out. But I'll be sure to tell him you said hello." Soon, the calls stopped coming. He was an island, and the waters around him were rising, cutting him off from every shore he had ever known. The most painful blow, the one that finally shattered his spirit, came a month into the conservatorship. He went down to his workshop, his one remaining sanctuary, to lose himself for a few hours in the familiar comfort of his craft. He walked down the wooden steps and froze. The room was half empty. The air felt wrong, hollow. It was the ultimate fear realized, to be erased by your own family, to become a ghost in your own home, your life's savings, nothing more than a ledger controlled by someone else. He had thought the greatest loss of his life was burying his wife Eleanor. He was wrong. This was a different kind of death, a living burial. His prized lathe, a magnificent cast-iron machine he'd saved for years to buy, was gone. His collection of Japanese handsaws, their blades like slivers of moonlight, his German chisels, their wooden handles worn smooth by his own grip, the tools he had collected over a lifetime, each one with a story, gone. An empty, oil-stained space on the concrete floor was all that remained of the lathe. Bare pegboard hooks stared back at him like vacant eyes. He stumbled back upstairs, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, a stitch of pure panic in his side. Laura was in the kitchen, humming as she put away groceries, the picture of domestic tranquility. "Laura? My tools. Where are my tools?" She didn't look at him, her back still turned as she placed a can of soup in the pantry. "Oh, that. I sold them, Dad. They were just collecting dust, and frankly, it's not safe for you to be operating heavy machinery anymore. We can't risk an accident. We got a good price. It's all going into your account, don't you worry." He stared at her, at the placid set of her face when she finally turned to him, and for the first time, he saw not a concerned daughter, but a stranger. A thief, a cold, calculating stranger who wore his daughter's face. The grief was so sharp, so sudden, it felt like a heart attack. Those tools weren't just metal and wood. They were an extension of his own hands, a repository of his life's work, a connection to every project he had ever poured his soul into. Selling them was like amputating a part of his soul. That night, he sat in the dark living room, the grandfather clock in the hall ticking away the seconds of his diminished life, and he wept. He wept for his tools, for his friends, for his wife, Eleanor, who would never have let this happen. He wept for the man he used to be. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket, and he felt it smothering the last embers of his fight. His days bled into one another, a monotonous gray cycle of supervised meals and the inane chatter of daytime television. Laura had hired a home health aide to check on him 3 times a week, a requirement of the court, she'd said. The first aide was a brusque older woman named Agnes who treated him like a piece of furniture. She would take his blood pressure with a rough efficiency that made him wince and speak about him in the third person. "He seems fine today," she'd report to Laura over the phone while he sat in the same room, invisible. "Ate all his lunch. No complaints." The second was a young woman named Tiffany who spent the entire hour staring at her phone, a thumb scrolling endlessly through a world he couldn't see, barely acknowledging his existence. She once burnt his toast and simply scraped the black parts into the sink before handing him the singed bread with a shrug. Then, on a drizzly Monday morning, the third one arrived. Her name was Sarah. She was a woman in her late 30s with kind, observant eyes and a quiet way about her. Unlike the others, she didn't talk down to him. She spoke to him like an equal. During her first visit, as she was putting her coat away, she noticed the model of the Charles W. Morgan on the mantelpiece. "Wow," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. She walked closer, leaning in to see the details. Did you make this? The detail is incredible. The rigging, it's perfect." Arthur, who hadn't spoken more than a few words in weeks, found himself clearing his throat. "I did," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He walked over and, to his own surprise, found himself describing the process, the type of basswood he'd used for the hull, the challenge of knotting the tiny shrouds with tweezers. The truth of his daughter's desperate act was far darker than a simple grab for money. It was a secret wrapped in years of resentment, a rot that had been festering just beneath the polished surface of their lives. Who was the woman in the back of the courtroom with worried eyes, the woman who looked away when he caught her gaze, and what did she know that could give him his life back? For 15 minutes, he was not a ward, not an incompetent old man, but an expert, a craftsman. Sarah listened, her gaze fixed on him, not the model, her head nodding. She saw him. And in that moment, a tiny, dormant seed of hope began to stir in the barren soil of his despair. Sarah became his lifeline. Her visits were breaths of fresh air in his suffocating world. She would linger after her official duties were done, asking him about the books in his study or the history of the house. He learned she was a single mother, working 2 jobs to make ends meet while putting herself through nursing school at night. He saw in her a decency and a quiet strength that reminded him so much of Eleanor. His trust in her grew cautiously, like a winter plant turning toward a weak sun. He began to test the waters, dropping small hints of his situation. He started small, a conversational probe. "Laura is very protective," he said one afternoon, watching her reaction. Sarah just nodded. "She seems to love you very much." Her non-committal answer was a test in itself. She wasn't siding with Laura, but she wasn't dismissing his comment either. A week later, while Laura was out at a supposed yoga class, he spoke in a low voice, his eyes on the kitchen door. "She sold my tools." Sarah stopped tidying the kitchen and looked at him, her expression serious. She didn't offer empty platitudes or change the subject. She just said, "I'm so sorry, Arthur. That's a terrible thing to lose." Her simple validation of his pain, the acknowledgement that his loss was real and unjust, was more powerful than any grand gesture could have been. He knew then that he might have found an ally. The impossible journey back from the precipice had to begin with a single step, and that step was trusting someone again. He decided to trust Sarah. His plan began to form in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and the fear and anger churned in his gut. He knew Laura's betrayal was rooted in his finances, but he didn't know the extent of it. He needed proof. He needed to find this man he was on paper, the man who existed in bank statements and tax returns, to prove he was not the befuddled creature Laura had described to the court. He remembered an old metal lockbox in the back of his closet, a place where he and Eleanor had kept important documents, birth certificates, the deed to the house, old savings bonds. Laura wouldn't have known about it. It was hidden behind a stack of Eleanor's old hat boxes. One rainy Tuesday, during Sarah's visit, he told her about it. His heart pounded as he spoke, the words coming out in a nervous whisper, terrified she would refuse, or worse, report him to Laura. "It's heavy," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't get it down myself." Sarah looked at the closet, then back at him. He saw a flicker of conflict in her eyes, the pull between her job's strict rules against getting involved in family matters and her own conscience. Her conscience won. "Okay, Arthur," she said softly, her voice firm. "Let's take a look." Together, they pulled the dusty box from the top shelf. Arthur's hands trembled as he worked the combination lock, the familiar click sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. Inside, nestled among yellowed papers that smelled of thyme and cedar, was a treasure trove. 20 years of financial statements from the investment firm he used, neatly bundled by year. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but he knew this was the starting point. Arthur Vance lived a life measured in 1/16 of an inch. As a master cabinet maker for 40 years, he understood the virtue of precision, the integrity of a perfectly joined corner, the patient transformation of raw timber into something of enduring beauty. The problem was, these were the before documents. He needed the after. He needed to see what Laura had been doing since the conservatorship began. Sarah had an idea, born of her own observations. "The mail," she whispered. "She keeps it all in her home office. I've seen the piles when I've dropped off paperwork for her, Nick, bank statements, everything." Laura lived only 10 minutes away. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, a slow, living death in this house, was unthinkable. Sarah agreed to help. She told him a story she hadn't shared before about her own grandmother who was taken advantage of by a smooth-talking contractor who had drained her savings. Sarah had been young and hadn't seen the signs until it was too late. "Not again," she said, her jaw set with a fierce determination. "Not on my watch." Their clandestine operation began, a quiet conspiracy conducted in whispers and stolen moments. Sarah started arriving for her shifts a few minutes early. On the days she knew Laura had a regular appointment, she would drive to Laura's house first. The first time, her hand shook so badly she could barely hold her phone. She used the excuse that she'd left a folder there the day before. Laura's husband, Rick, was home, and he let her in with a distracted wave. While he was on a loud business call in the other room, she slipped into the small office. The desk was a disaster zone of papers. Her heart pounded in her ears as she found the right stack, statements from Arthur's bank, and quickly photographed them, her breath held tight in her chest. Arthur, meanwhile, spent hours at his kitchen table, a magnifying glass in one hand and a pen in the other, painstakingly comparing the old statements from his lockbox with the new images on Sarah's phone. The picture that emerged was horrifying, a systematic demolition of his life's savings. There were large, unexplained withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time, listed simply as transfers. His blue-chip stocks, the conservative anchors of his portfolio that he'd held for decades, had been sold off. A separate account, one he didn't recognize, had been opened in his name, and money was being funneled into it and then withdrawn in cash. The man on these pages was a reckless spendthrift, a gambler throwing away his retirement. It was a portrait of a stranger, a fiction created by his daughter to fund a life he couldn't begin to imagine. One entry in particular made his blood run cold. It was a payment of $5,000 to something called Westgate Appraisers. He knew that name. They were a high-end art and antiques dealer downtown. His mind instantly went to the painting that had hung over the fireplace for 30 years, a beautiful, moody landscape by an Ohio artist that Eleanor had inherited from her mother. It was the one piece of real value they owned, but its worth was more sentimental than monetary. He rushed into the living room, his slippers shuffling on the hardwood floor. The wall was bare, a pale rectangle of unfaded wallpaper marking the spot where the painting had been. When he had asked Laura about it weeks ago, she had said it was out being professionally cleaned and reframed as a surprise for him. Staring at the empty space on the wall, a hollow ache spread through his chest. He now knew he would never see it again. She hadn't just sold his tools. She was selling his memories, piece by piece, liquidating his past. His home in suburban Ohio, a sturdy colonial with dark green shutters he repainted every 5 years, was a living museum of this philosophy. He had built the bookshelves that lined the study, their shelves groaning happily under the weight of history books and naval biographies, each one perfectly level, perfectly spaced, the scent of aged paper and lemon oil a constant comfort. They knew they had evidence of financial malfeasance, but what could they do? Arthur was a ghost in the system, with no legal right to hire a lawyer or even make a phone call without his conservator's permission. Sarah was their only link to the outside world. Using her own time and her own money, she started making calls during her lunch breaks, sitting in her car with a list of lawyers. The first few she spoke to were dismissive, their tone patronizing. "Ma'am, these cases are very difficult. The burden of proof is on your client. Does he have a formal psychiatric evaluation refuting the first one?" they'd ask. They explained that overturning a conservatorship was nearly impossible without concrete proof of the conservator's criminal intent and overwhelming evidence of the ward's lucidity. It was a catch-22 designed to keep the powerless powerless. Finally, a woman at a legal aid society listened to the whole story and gave her a name: Ben Carter. He was a young, overworked, and deeply idealistic lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. He agreed to meet them, pro bono. The meeting itself required a level of subterfuge worthy of a spy novel. Sarah scheduled a fake doctor's appointment for Arthur, a routine checkup with a fictitious Dr. Miller across town. Laura, believing it was legitimate, agreed to let Sarah drive him. On the way, they took a detour to a small, unassuming law office above a laundromat, the smell of warm soap wafting up the stairwell. Ben Carter was in his early 30s, with a rumpled suit, tired eyes, and an intense, focused energy. He listened to their story for an hour without interruption, his eyes flicking from Arthur's earnest face to the photographic evidence on Sarah's phone. When they were finished, he leaned back in his creaky chair. "This is bad," he said, running a hand through his messy hair. "But it's also good. She's not just incompetent, she's sloppy. She's left a trail a mile wide. But we need more. We need what the court considers irrefutable proof of your competency, Arthur. And we need to find out where all this money is going. We need a smoking gun." Ben filed a motion for a competency review on Arthur's behalf, a legal long shot that would at least get them back in front of a judge. The court date was set for 6 weeks away. It was a race against time. Ben tasked Arthur with a difficult piece of homework to write down his life story. His financial history, his work history, memories of his wife, his relationship with Laura, the events leading up to the conservatorship. "Details, Arthur," Ben had urged, his eyes locking with Arthur's. "Give me dates, names, amounts. Show them your mind is a steel trap, not a sieve." For weeks, Arthur wrote. He filled legal pads with his neat architectural handwriting. The act of writing was therapy, a way of reclaiming his own narrative from the fiction Laura had created. He wrote about the day he met Eleanor at a dance, the smell of her gardenia perfume. He wrote about the day Laura was born, the terrifying and exhilarating weight of her in his arms. And he wrote about the growing, gnawing question that haunted his every waking moment. How had that tiny, perfect baby become the woman who would steal his life from him? Meanwhile, Sarah and Ben dug into Laura's life. Ben, using his legal credentials, was able to subpoena financial records that Sarah, as a civilian, couldn't access.